Deep beneath the streets, sealed inside heavily guarded underground vaults, lie millions of pages of classified files. Governments built these literal bunkers not to protect stolen gold, biological weapons, or launch codes. They built them to lock away ideas. Ideas scribbled on cheap, ink-stained paper by a penniless, cigar-smoking fugitive who was relentlessly hunted across Europe by secret police. But before we unlock the heavy steel doors of that vault to see what terrified them so much, I want to know exactly who I'm talking to today. This is a story that literally split the globe in half. So let's see how far our connection reaches right now. Take 1 second, head down to the comments, and tell me your current city and the exact time you are watching this. Are you sipping morning coffee in Chicago? Is it midnight in Sydney? Drop your location and time below so we can see where everyone is tuning in from. All right, back to the vault. The man whose writings triggered all this security didn't command a single soldier. He never sat on a throne or ran a corporation. In fact, for most of his life, he was a stateless refugee who couldn't even afford to pay his own rent, constantly pawning his winter coat just to buy food for his family. Yet, his words terrified emperors, toppled ancient dynasties, and sparked the most explosive, fast-paced, and thrilling century in human history. His name was Karl Marx. Forget everything you think you know about dusty textbooks, boring college lectures, and dry economic theories. We aren't doing that today. This is a high-stakes historical thriller. It's a raw story of underground spy networks, forbidden romance, bitter betrayals, frantic escapes across borders under the cover of darkness, and how one single, radical mind became the ultimate weapon of mass disruption. You are about to meet the most dangerous philosopher in history. Buckle up. When you picture Karl Marx, what comes to mind? Let me guess. A grumpy, old, heavily bearded man staring out from a black and white photograph, buried under a mountain of dusty books, completely disconnected from the real world. Erase that image from your mind right now. Because before he was a global icon of revolution, Karl Marx was a highly chaotic, wildly reckless, gun-carrying teenage frat boy who was more likely to be found passed out in an alleyway than reading in a library. To understand how he became the architect of modern rebellion, we have to go back to where it all started. Not with a political manifesto, but with a bar fight. The year was 1818. Karl was born in Trier, a small ancient city nestled in the Rhineland, a region that had just been swallowed up by the fiercely conservative, militaristic kingdom of Prussia. He was born into a comfortably middle-class family, but there was a hidden tension simmering just beneath the surface. His family was of Jewish heritage, descending from a long line of rabbis. However, the Prussian government had recently passed strict laws barring Jews from holding public office or practicing law. Faced with the prospect of losing his entire livelihood and plunging his family into poverty, Karl's father, Heinrich Marx, did what he had to do to survive. He swallowed his pride, abandoned his ancestral faith, and officially converted to Protestantism. This single, pragmatic act of survival gave young Karl a comfortable childhood, but it also quietly planted a very dangerous seed in his mind. The realization that the state held absolute, ruthless power over a person's identity, their beliefs, and their ability to put food on the table. The rules of society were not made by God. They were made by men with power. But as a teenager, Karl wasn't thinking about overthrowing the government. He was a pampered, fiercely intelligent, but incredibly arrogant kid. Nicknamed the Moor by his family because of his dark complexion and thick, jet-black hair, Karl was the center of his father's universe. Heinrich had a very specific, very safe plan for his brilliant son. Karl would go to a prestigious university, get a law degree, become a respectable attorney, and live a quiet, wealthy life. In the fall of 1835, 17-year-old Karl packed his bags and headed down the river to the University of Bonn. Heinrich breathed a sigh of relief, believing his son was on the path to high society. He couldn't have been more wrong. The moment Karl arrived in Bonn, he tasted true freedom, and he went absolutely off the rails. The University of Bonn in the 1830s wasn't exactly an Ivy League sanctuary of quiet study. It was a chaotic, testosterone-fueled playground for wealthy young men, and Karl threw himself into the underground college culture with terrifying enthusiasm. Forget about law books. Karl's immediate priority was joining a drinking society. He didn't just join one. He became the co-president of the Trier Tavern Club. Under Karl's leadership, this wasn't a group that sat around sipping wine and discussing poetry. They were notorious. They were loud, belligerent, and entirely out of control. Karl and his gang would spend their nights chugging massive amounts of beer, roaming the cobblestone streets of Bonn, smashing lanterns, and picking fights with anyone who looked at them the wrong way. He was blowing through his father's money at an astonishing rate, racking up massive debts at local taverns and tailors. He barely attended his classes. Instead, he was busy running from the police. His behavior became so erratic and disruptive that the university authorities finally stepped in. Karl was arrested for disturbing the peace and drunkenness and was thrown into the Karzer, the university's dreaded student prison. For 24 hours, the future author of the Communist Manifesto sat locked in a freezing, damp cell, staring at the stone walls, nursing a massive hangover. But a night in jail didn't slow him down. It only escalated things. The drinking clubs in Bonn were intensely tribal, and the rivalries often spilled over into actual violence. The most elite, snobbish fraternity on campus was the Borussia Corps, made up of arrogant Prussian aristocrats and military cadets. They looked down on Karl's ragged group of drinkers. Insults were thrown. Tensions reached a boiling point. And in 19th century Germany, there was only one way young men settled their differences: a duel. Yes, Karl Marx, the philosopher, engaged in an illegal, underground sword duel. It wasn't a theatrical fencing match. It was a brutal, bloody clash with sharpened blades. In August 1836, Karl squared off against a Prussian cadet. During the furious exchange of steel, the cadet's blade slipped past Karl's guard and slashed him directly across the face, slicing into his flesh just above his left eye. Blood poured down his face. He survived, but he would carry that dueling scar for the rest of his life. Things had completely spiraled out of control. To make matters worse, the local police caught Karl carrying a concealed, loaded pistol without a permit. He was playing a very dangerous game, teetering on the edge of getting expelled or getting killed. Back home in Trier, Heinrich Marx was reading the tuition bills, the debt notices, and the police reports with absolute horror. His dream of his son becoming a respectable lawyer was disintegrating. Heinrich wrote furious, desperate letters to Karl, demanding to know why his son was acting like a wild, unkempt genius, wasting his life in taverns. Finally, the father had enough. He pulled the ultimate parental trump card. He cut off the fun. "You are leaving Bonn immediately," Heinrich decreed. "I am transferring you to the University of Berlin." It was supposed to be a punishment. Berlin, the capital of the Prussian Empire, was the polar opposite of Bonn. It was cold, dark, strict, heavily militarized, and intensely serious. Heinrich believed that the grim, disciplined atmosphere of Berlin would finally break Karl's rebellious streak and force him to sit down, shut up, and study the law. Ironically, sending Karl to Berlin was the greatest mistake his father ever made. It didn't extinguish Karl's fire. It merely gave it a deadly focus. When Karl arrived in Berlin in the winter of 1836, the city was a pressure cooker. It was the intellectual capital of Europe, but it was operating under the iron fist of King Friedrich Wilhelm III. Censorship was everywhere. Secret police roamed the streets. You couldn't speak out against the government or the church without risking prison. At first, Karl tried to obey his father. He attended law lectures. He even tried his hand at writing terrible, angst-filled romantic poetry. But the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of Berlin was suffocating him. He was exhausted by the rigid rules and the ancient, outdated laws he was being forced to memorize. Then, he discovered the underground. Not the drunken, brawling underground of Bonn, but something far more dangerous: the intellectual underground. Karl stumbled into a group known as the Young Hegelians, named after the recently deceased rock star philosopher of the era, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. These young men were the punks and rebels of the 1830s academic world. They were brilliant, cynical, and highly subversive. Because they couldn't openly criticize the Prussian government without getting arrested, they used philosophy as their camouflage. They would gather in smoke-filled rooms, specifically a place called the Doctors' Club at a local cafe, drinking cheap wine and engaging in fierce, high-speed debates until the sun came up. When Karl walked into the Doctors' Club, it was like a lightning bolt hit him. He found his people. He immediately stopped going to his law classes. He let his hair and beard grow out wildly, completely abandoning his physical appearance. He stopped sleeping, surviving on black coffee, cigars, and adrenaline. He consumed books by the hundreds: history, philosophy, economics, art, reading with a manic intensity, filling notebooks with his frantic handwriting. The young Hegelians were fascinated by this intense, fiery young man with the dueling scar on his face. Karl was ruthless in debate. He didn't just want to discuss ideas. He wanted to tear them apart and see how they worked. The crucial shift happened here in these smoky Berlin cafes. In Bonn, Karl had rebelled against authority by breaking windows and fighting cadets. It was childish. But in Berlin, surrounded by radical thinkers, his rebellion mutated. He realized that fighting cops in the street was pointless. If you really wanted to fight back, you had to attack the system that gave the cops their power in the first place. He began to view the world not as a set of rules handed down by God or kings, but as a massive, man-made machine. A machine designed to keep the powerful at the top and the powerless at the bottom. And he decided, right then and there, that he was going to figure out exactly how that machine worked. His father's dream of a quiet, respectable lawyer was officially dead. The reckless frat boy had been replaced by a razor-sharp, heavily armed intellectual radical. Karl Marx was no longer just a danger to himself. As he prepared to leave the university and step out into the real world, He was about to become a danger to the entire established order of Europe. If you want to understand what drove Karl Marx, you have to look past the political rallies and the dense economic manuscripts and look at a very different kind of rebellion. A forbidden, highly scandalous cross-class romance. Before he was the father of communism, Marx was a desperately romantic, deeply flawed, 20-something poet who managed to pull off one of the most unlikely love stories of the 19th century. Her name was Jenny von Westphalen, and on paper, she and Karl had absolutely no business being together. Jenny was the undisputed it girl of Trier. She was 4 years older than Karl, stunningly beautiful, highly educated, and most importantly, she was pure Prussian aristocracy. Her father, Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, was a high-ranking government official. Her half-brother would eventually become the hyper-conservative Minister of the Interior for Prussia, the very man whose police forces would later spend decades trying to hunt Karl Marx down. Jenny grew up in a world of sprawling estates, grand ballroom dances, silk dresses, and aristocratic privilege. Karl, as we know, was the son of a middle-class lawyer from a Jewish background who had barely escaped the university jails of Bonn. He was notoriously messy, chain-smoked cheap cigars, kept irregular hours, and was rapidly developing a reputation as a radical troublemaker. Yet, against all odds, the aristocrat and the radical fell wildly in love. Their courtship was something out of a clandestine spy novel. In 1836, knowing that both of their families and polite society at large would absolutely lose their minds if they found out, Karl and Jenny got secretly engaged. For years, they communicated through smuggled letters, hiding their relationship from the gossiping elite of Trier. Jenny turned down proposals from wealthy, decorated military officers, choosing instead to wait for a penniless, rebellious student who was currently picking fights with the government in Berlin. This secret engagement lasted for 7 long years. During this time, Karl was trying to figure out how to make a living. His original plan, after finishing his fierce debates with the young Hegelians in Berlin, was to become a university professor. He thought he could fight the system from inside the classroom, but the Prussian government had other plans. In 1840, a new king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, took the throne. He was a reactionary who despised the progressive, critical thinking brewing in the universities. The king initiated a massive crackdown. He fired Karl's academic mentors, purged the universities of any professor who dared to question the absolute authority of the monarchy or the church, and effectively slammed the door shut on Karl's academic career before it even began. Marx was locked out of the ivory tower. He was 24 years old, deeply in debt, engaged to a baroness who was patiently waiting for him to get his life together, and entirely unemployed. He needed a job. But more importantly, he realized that writing obscure philosophical essays for a few dozen college students was useless. If you wanted to change the world, if you wanted to actually threaten the powerful men sitting in their palaces, you needed a megaphone. He found that megaphone in the smoky, ink-stained, frantic world of journalism. In 1842, Karl moved to the bustling, industrialized city of Cologne. A group of wealthy, liberal businessmen had just started a new daily newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung, the Rhenish Gazette. They wanted a paper that would advocate for free speech, better business regulations, and mild reforms. They hired the fiery young Marx as a contributor. Within months, Marx didn't just contribute, he completely took over. His work ethic was terrifying. Fueled by endless cups of black coffee and cigars, he worked through the night, writing articles with a razor-sharp, vicious, and deeply sarcastic style that completely electrified the reading public. The liberal businessmen who owned the paper were terrified by his radicalism, but they couldn't deny the results. Subscriptions skyrocketed. The paper became the most talked-about publication in Germany. Marx was quickly promoted to editor-in-chief. This was the moment Karl Marx truly stepped onto the battlefield. From his chaotic editor's desk, he launched a relentless, daily assault on the Prussian state. But he wasn't just writing about abstract philosophical concepts anymore. Working at a daily newspaper forced Marx to look at the grim, gritty reality of the world around him. He started reading reports about the extreme poverty in the surrounding rural areas. The turning point came when Marx wrote a series of explosive articles about firewood. It sounds mundane, but it was the spark that ignited his economic awakening. For centuries, poor peasants in the Rhineland had the traditional right to walk into the local forests and pick up dead, fallen branches to heat their homes and cook their food. It was a matter of basic survival. But as the Industrial Revolution kicked into gear, timber became a highly valuable commodity. The wealthy landowners pushed a new law through the government. Suddenly, picking up fallen twigs was reclassified as theft. Overnight, thousands of starving, freezing peasants were thrown into prison simply for trying to survive, while the landowners grew richer. Marx was furious. He used the front page of the Rheinische Zeitung to tear the government apart. He pointed out the blatant hypocrisy of a legal system that protected the property rights of the rich while criminalizing the basic survival of the poor. He argued that the state wasn't a neutral referee maintaining order. It was a weapon used by the wealthy to crush the vulnerable. This was a massive shift. Marx realized that the real problem wasn't just bad kings or strict religion. It was economics. It was about who owned the resources and who was forced to work for them. His articles hit the Prussian government like a sledgehammer. The authorities panicked. Running a newspaper in 1840s, Prussia was a daily game of cat and mouse with the government censors. Every evening, a state official would literally walk into Marx's office, read the proof sheets of the next day's paper, and cross out anything he didn't like. Marx, naturally, viewed this as a challenge. He became a master of literary evasion. He would use heavy sarcasm, double meanings, and complex metaphors to slip his radical critiques right past the not-so-bright government censors. When the censors realized they were being made to look like fools, they started deploying double and triple censorship teams just to monitor Marx's desk. The breaking point didn't even come from Germany. Marx published a scathing article criticizing the Russian Empire, which was Europe's most brutal, absolute monarchy at the time. The article somehow made its way to St. Petersburg and landed directly on the desk of Tsar Nicholas I. The Russian emperor was enraged. He immediately sent a diplomatic threat to the King of Prussia: "Shut down this newspaper, or else." The Prussian government, terrified of angering the massive Russian Empire, dropped the hammer. In early 1843, heavily armed police raided the offices of the Rheinische Zeitung. They seized the printing presses, banned the newspaper permanently, and effectively blacklisted Karl Marx from ever working in German journalism again. He had lost his job, his platform, and his home country. The police were now keeping a permanent file on him. But amidst this professional disaster, he finally achieved his greatest personal victory. In June 1843, after 7 years of secret letters, agonizing delays, and fighting off the fierce objections of her aristocratic family, Karl Marx and Jenny von Westphalen were finally married. It was a bittersweet victory. Jenny had traded her life of aristocratic luxury for a life permanently on the run. Because of Karl's growing notoriety, remaining in Germany was no longer an option. The secret police were breathing down their necks. They needed to escape. They needed a place where the air was free, where radical ideas weren't crushed by censorship, and where a disgraced journalist could plot his next move. There was only one city in Europe that fit the bill, a city that had a history of dragging kings to the guillotine, a city currently swarming with spies, artists, exiled revolutionaries, and utopian dreamers. The newlyweds packed their few belongings, crossed the border in the dead of night, and headed for the beating heart of European rebellion. Paris. Marx didn't know it yet, but waiting for him in the smoky cafes of the French capital was another young German expat. A man who wore tailored suits, rode horses, drank expensive champagne, and happened to be the heir to a massive, ruthless capitalist empire. A man whose name was Friedrich Engels. The collision of these two minds was about to change the trajectory of human history. Paris in the summer of 1844 was not the romantic, tourist-filled city of light we think of today. It was a boiling cauldron of political dissent. If you were a rebel, an exiled poet, an anarchist, or a fugitive on the run from the conservative monarchies of Europe, Paris was the only place to be. The city was crawling with spies, secret police, and informants, but it was also bursting with underground printing presses and radical cafes. When Karl and Jenny Marx arrived in this chaotic metropolis, they were broke, essentially stateless, and completely unsure of their future. Karl immediately threw himself into the underground scene, writing for a radical German-language newspaper called Vorwärts, Forward. He was rubbing shoulders with some of the most dangerous and brilliant minds of the 19th century. Anarchists who wanted to blow up the state, and utopian dreamers who wanted to build perfect communes. But Marx found most of them exhausting. They had plenty of anger, but no real plan. They were dealing in fantasies. Marx was looking for the cold, hard mechanics of how the world actually worked. And then, on August 28, 1844, he walked into the Café de la Régence, a famous chess club and coffee house in the heart of Paris. Waiting for him was a 23-year-old German expat. If you were casting a movie about a gritty underground revolution, this man is the absolute last person you would pick to play the co-founder of communism. He was impeccably dressed in tailored English suits. He was devastatingly handsome, loved fine wine, rode horses, fenced, and chased women with the energy of a rock star. More importantly, he was the heir to a massive, ruthless, multinational textile empire. He was a literal titan of industry. His name was Friedrich Engels, and his collision with Karl Marx is arguably the most consequential, contradictory, and deeply fascinating friendship in recorded history. To understand how a billionaire in waiting became the financial and intellectual engine behind the destruction of capitalism, you have to look at Engels' bizarre double life. Engels was born in Barmen, Prussia, to a fiercely conservative, deeply religious father who owned booming textile mills in Germany and England. His father looked at Friedrich's youthful interest in poetry and philosophy with absolute disgust. Determined to whip his son into a proper money-making capitalist, Engels' father pulled him out of high school and shipped him off to Manchester, England, to learn the family business at the Ehrman and Engels cotton mill. Manchester in the 1840s was the undisputed capital of the Industrial Revolution. It was a place of staggering wealth and unimaginable horror. It was Shock City. When young Engels arrived, he did exactly what his father wanted during the day. He sat in the management office, crunched the numbers, maximized profits, and walked the factory floor. He was a highly effective capitalist boss. But when the sun went down, Friedrich Engels lived a completely different life. He took off his tailored suit, put on rough clothes, and, guided by an illiterate Irish factory worker named Mary Burns, who would become the love of his life, he ventured into the darkest, most dangerous slums of Manchester. What he saw there shattered his worldview. He saw children as young as 6 working 14-hour shifts under massive, deafening mechanical looms, their hands routinely crushed by the gears. He saw families of 10 living in single, windowless cellar rooms flooded with raw sewage. He saw a life expectancy for working-class men that hovered around 17 years old. Engels meticulously documented everything. He gathered the cold, hard data of human suffering. He realized that the immense wealth of the British Empire and his own family's fortune was literally built on a mountain of working-class corpses. So, when Engels sat down with Marx at the Café de la Régence in Paris, he wasn't bringing abstract philosophy to the table. He was bringing receipts. Their meeting was supposed to be a quick catch-up. They had briefly crossed paths a few years earlier and actually hadn't liked each other much. But this time, it was like a match hitting a powder keg. A quick coffee turned into a 10-day, non-stop marathon of talking, debating, and drinking. For 10 days and 10 nights, fueled by rivers of Parisian wine, dark beer, and endless cigars, the two men laid out their visions of the world. It was the ultimate intellectual symbiosis. They were the perfect puzzle pieces. Marx was the razor-sharp, heavily armed philosophical genius who could see the massive, invisible structures of history and economics. But Marx was stuck in his books. He had never actually set foot inside a factory. Engels, on the other hand, was the boots-on-the-ground operative. He knew exactly how a supply chain worked. He knew how wages were calculated. He knew the precise smell of the Manchester slums. Engels showed Marx his upcoming manuscript, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Marx read it and was completely blown away. It was the missing piece. Marx finally understood that the misery of the poor wasn't just a sad accident of nature, and it wasn't a moral failing. It was a mathematical requirement of the capitalist system. For the boss to get rich, the worker had to be paid less than the value of what they produced. The entire system was a machine designed to extract human energy and turn it into capital. By the end of those 10 days, the two men had formed a pact that would last until the day they died. They would no longer just interpret the world. They were going to figure out how to tear it down and rebuild it. But the authorities were not going to make it easy. While Marx and Engels were plotting the future in Paris cafes, the Prussian government back in Berlin was growing increasingly paranoid. King Friedrich Wilhelm IV was furious about the scathing articles Marx was publishing in the underground newspaper Vorwärts. The Prussian secret police had tracked Marx to Paris and were reading every word he wrote. Because Prussia was a major military power, they used their diplomatic muscle to squeeze the French government. "Silence this man," the Prussian king demanded, "or there will be consequences." The French government, desperate to avoid an international incident over a scruffy journalist, caved. In January 1845, there was a heavy knock on the door of Marx's Paris apartment. It was the French Ministry of the Interior. They handed Marx an official decree. He was designated a threat to public order and had exactly 24 hours to pack his bags and get out of France. It was a devastating blow. Karl had to flee immediately, crossing the border into Belgium. He left behind a heavily pregnant Jenny and their young daughter, Jennichen. Left alone in Paris with the police watching her, Jenny had to frantically sell off their furniture, their silverware, and anything of value just to pay off their outstanding debts and buy train tickets to follow her husband into his second exile. The family reunited in Brussels, Belgium. Brussels was a quieter, grayer city than Paris, and the Belgian government was slightly more tolerant of political refugees, but only under one strict condition. When Marx arrived, he was forced to sign a legally binding pledge with the Belgian police, swearing that he would not publish a single word about current politics while living in their country. Marx, of course, signed the paper, and then immediately began looking for loopholes. He couldn't publish political articles, sure, but he could organize. Engels, furious about his friend's expulsion from Paris, quickly packed his bags and joined Marx in Brussels. They realized that writing brilliant articles wasn't enough. The working class of Europe was fragmented. The French socialists were arguing with the German radicals. The English trade unionists had no idea what the Italian anarchists were doing. If they were going to fight a global capitalist system, they needed a global resistance network. Operating out of Marx's cramped Brussels home, they established the Communist Correspondence Committee. It sounds like a boring bureaucratic office, but in reality, it was a covert intelligence hub. They spent their days furiously writing letters, trying to link together underground revolutionary cells in London, Paris, Cologne, and beyond. They were building the very first international network of radical leftists. But to lead a working-class movement, Marx actually needed to see the working class in action. In the summer of 1845, Engels took Marx on a highly secretive reconnaissance mission across the English Channel. Engels took him to Manchester. For Marx, stepping into Manchester was like stepping onto another planet. He had spent his life in the ancient, quiet towns of Germany and the romantic streets of Paris. Now he was standing in the belly of the industrial beast. The sky was permanently stained black with coal smoke. The rivers ran unnatural colors from chemical dyes. The noise of 1,000 steam engines thrummed through the cobblestones, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Engels took Marx into the mills. He showed him the spinning mules and the terrifying pace of the assembly lines. He took him into the slums of Little Ireland, where Marx saw the absolute degradation of human life. People living in literal filth, coughing up their lungs, working until their bodies physically snapped. This trip to England fundamentally altered Karl Marx's DNA. It stripped away any lingering romantic illusions he had about philosophy. Sitting in the beautiful Chetham's Library in Manchester, where you can still see the exact wooden desk they worked at today, Marx and Engels began to synthesize everything. They weren't just angry young men anymore. They were gathering intelligence on enemy territory. They returned to Brussels highly energized, but their daily lives were a constant, grinding struggle. While Engels had access to his family's massive textile fortune, his father kept him on a tight leash, severely restricting his allowance to try and force him to abandon his radical friends. Engels would constantly sneak whatever money he could to Marx, but it was never enough. The secret police were always watching. The Belgian authorities routinely intercepted their mail. They lived with the constant, gnawing anxiety that at any moment the door could be kicked in, and they could be thrown into prison or deported to face trial in Prussia. They were men without a country, living out of suitcases, deeply in debt, and armed with nothing but ink and paper. Yet, by 1847, their underground networking began to pay off. A secretive, shadowy organization based in London called the League of the Just reached out to them. The League was a militant, underground group of radical German artisans and workers who had been involved in violent uprisings in the past. They had read the letters coming out of the Brussels Correspondence Committee. They realized that their group had a lot of passion, but they lacked a coherent strategy. They didn't really understand how to win. They invited Marx and Engels to join them and, astonishingly, asked them to completely restructure their secret society. Marx and Engels agreed, but on their own terms. They hated the melodramatic, cult-like secrecy of the League. They demanded that the organization stop hiding in the shadows and step out into the light as a legitimate political party. They convinced the League to change its motto from the emotional, vague, "all men are brothers," to something sharp, aggressive, and undeniably clear. "Working men of all countries, unite." The League of the Just was officially dissolved. In its place, the Communist League was born. It was the winter of 1847. Across the continent, harvests were failing. People were starving in the streets of Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. The economy was crashing. The air was thick with tension, smelling of gunpowder and desperation. Europe was a massive room filled with explosive gas, just waiting for a single spark. The leaders of the newly formed Communist League looked at their two most brilliant minds, the scruffy philosopher from Trier and the millionaire radical from Barmen, and gave them an urgent, highly classified mission. They needed a manifesto, a short, punchy, explosive document that would explain to the world exactly who they were, what they wanted, and how they were going to get it. And they needed it immediately. The clock was ticking, and the world was about to catch fire. London, November, 1847. The air inside the Red Lion pub in Soho was thick with the suffocating smell of cheap tobacco, spilled ale, and damp wool. Upstairs, in a small, poorly lit meeting room, delegates from across the continent had gathered in absolute secrecy. These were the leaders of the newly formed Communist League. They were tailors, watchmakers, exiled journalists, and hardened street fighters. And they were listening to Karl Marx. For 10 days, the 29-year-old Marx, backed by the wealthy and sharply dressed Friedrich Engels, had been dominating the room. With his booming voice and aggressive debating style, Marx was systematically tearing down the old, romantic, utopian ideas of the League and replacing them with his cold, hard, analytical vision of class warfare. He wasn't talking about brotherhood or love. He was talking about historical inevitability, the collapse of global markets, and the violent overthrow of the ruling class. The delegates were mesmerized. They had never heard anyone speak with such terrifying clarity. When the Congress finally concluded in early December, the Central Committee of the League gave Marx and Engels a highly sensitive, monumental task. "We agree with your theories," they essentially told him. "Now, write them down. We need a manifesto. We need a declaration of exactly what this league stands for, and we need it immediately." Marx accepted the assignment with supreme confidence. He packed his bags, took the train and ferry back to his cramped apartment in Brussels, sat down at his ink-stained desk, and then did what Karl Marx was most famous for doing. He completely blew off the deadline. To understand the creation of the most influential political pamphlet in human history, you have to understand a deeply frustrating truth about its author. Karl Marx was a chronic, catastrophic procrastinator. He was a genius, yes. But his mind was so hyperactive, so desperate to understand absolutely everything in the universe, that he found it nearly impossible to finish a single project. When he was supposed to be writing the manifesto, he would suddenly decide that he couldn't write another word until he had read 5 massive volumes on the history of ancient Roman agriculture. Then he would get distracted by a new book on the mathematics of British banking. Then he would spend 3 days engaged in a bitter, sarcastic letter-writing campaign against some obscure rival socialist in France whom nobody cared about. His desk in Brussels was a disaster zone of half-finished manuscripts, towering stacks of stolen newspapers, and overflowing ashtrays. He was a notorious perfectionist who would rewrite a single paragraph 50 times, only to cross the whole thing out and start over. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and the political climate in Europe was rapidly deteriorating. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was brutal. Crop failures across the continent had caused the price of bread to skyrocket. Starving peasants were rioting in the countryside. In the cities, unemployed factory workers were clashing with armed police. The continent was a massive powder keg, and the fuse was already lit. Back in London, the leaders of the Communist League were pacing the floor. They were desperate. They knew a revolution was coming, and they needed their manifesto to rally the workers. December passed. No manuscript. The first half of January passed. Still nothing but excuses from Brussels. Finally, the Central Committee lost its patience. They realized that asking Marx nicely wasn't going to work. He needed a gun to his head. On January 24th, 1848, the Central Committee drafted a formal, heavily stamped resolution and sent it across the English Channel. It wasn't a polite reminder. It was a brutal ultimatum. The letter read, "The Central Committee charges its regional committee in Brussels to communicate with Citizen Marx and to tell him that if the manifesto of the Communist Party, the writing of which he undertook at the last Congress, does not reach London by Tuesday, February 1st of this year, further measures will be taken against him. In the event that Citizen Marx does not write the manifesto, the Central Committee demands the immediate return of all documents entrusted to him." Translated from bureaucratic speak, this meant, "Write the damn book this week, or you are fired, you are expelled from the movement, and we are sending thugs to confiscate your notes and give them to someone else." When Marx opened that letter in Brussels, the panic finally set in. He had less than a week to distill his entire world view, thousands of years of human history, and a blueprint for global revolution into a single, readable document. He locked himself in his study. He stopped sleeping. He fueled himself with black coffee and his incredibly cheap, terrible-smelling cigars. He wasn't starting entirely from scratch. Engels had previously written a rough draft called The Principles of Communism. But Engels's version was written in a dry, boring, question and answer format, like a church catechism. Question 1. What is communism? Question 2. What is the proletariat? Marx looked at Engels's draft and threw the format out the window. He knew that tired, overworked, angry factory workers were not going to read a dry academic Q&A. He needed to write something that felt like a sledgehammer. It needed to be poetic. It needed to be terrifying. It needed to sound like the voice of history itself declaring war. With Jenny, his aristocratic wife, acting as his frantic secretary, deciphering his terrible scrawled handwriting and copying the drafts onto clean paper, Marx began to sprint. He paced the room, dictating, crossing out, pacing again. He was weaving together everything he had learned from the underground clubs in Berlin, the smoky cafes of Paris, and the horrifying slums of Manchester. He was synthesizing philosophy, economics, and pure, concentrated rage. And then he found the rhythm. He wrote an opening line that was designed to sound like a horror story to the ruling class. He didn't start with economics. He started with a ghost story. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. From there, the dam broke. The words poured out in a torrential, rhythmic flood. He summarized the entire span of human existence in one devastating sentence. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. He described capitalism not as an evil conspiracy, but as a terrifying, unstoppable, magical force that was transforming the globe. He praised the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, for tearing down feudalism, building massive cities, and connecting the world with trains and telegraphs. But then, the twist. He argued that the capitalists were like a sorcerer who had summoned a magical spell they could no longer control. By building these massive factories, they had created a new class of people, the working class, the proletariat, who were now locked inside the machine. And eventually those workers were going to realize their own power, turn around, and destroy their creators. He didn't just want to interpret the economy. He wanted to arm the workers with a psychological weapon. He wanted them to realize they had nothing to lose. As the February 1st deadline loomed, Marx frantically pushed through the final pages. He ended the document not with a philosophical summary, but with a battle cry, shouting across the borders of nations, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." He gathered up the ink-stained pages. He had done it. He had taken the massive, chaotic storm of ideas in his head and forged them into a sleek, 23-page weapon. The manuscript was immediately bundled, sealed, and rushed to the post office to be sent to London. When the manuscript arrived in England, there was no grand ceremony. The Central Committee took the pages to the Workers' Educational Association at 46 Liverpool Street in London, an organization composed largely of exiled German typesetters. In a dingy, ink-splattered back room, they quietly set the type by hand. In the final week of February 1848, the Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, Manifesto of the Communist Party, was printed. It was a flimsy, thin little pamphlet bound in a cheap, dark green paper cover. There was no author's name on the front. It looked like thousands of other cheap political flyers circulating at the time. Marx, exhausted in Brussels, probably thought he had finally bought himself some breathing room. He had met the deadline. He had satisfied the London committee. Now he could finally go back to his quiet, obsessive research. But history has an incredibly twisted sense of timing. Just as the wet ink was drying on those dark green pamphlets in London, just as the very first copies were being loaded into boxes to be smuggled across the English Channel, a gun went off in the streets of Paris. Marx had predicted that a massive global revolution was inevitable. But he had no idea that his prediction was about to come true exactly 5 seconds after he put his pen down. The ghost he had just written about was about to step off the page, tear through the streets of Europe, and set the entire continent on fire. If you pitched the events of late February 1848 to a Hollywood studio, they would probably reject the script for being completely unbelievable. The timing was simply too perfect, too cinematic. Just as the exhausted typesetters in London were pulling the very first damp copies of the Communist Manifesto off the printing presses, the entire European continent completely lost its mind. Marx had literally just written that a specter is haunting Europe, predicting an imminent, massive explosion between the working class and the ruling elites. He assumed this might happen in a few years, maybe a decade. He had no idea it was going to happen by the weekend. It started in Paris. On February 22nd, 1848, the French government attempted to ban a massive political banquet, basically a thinly veiled anti-government rally. The working class of Paris, who were starving, broke, and exhausted by the corrupt monarchy of King Louis Philippe, didn't just protest. They tore up the cobblestones. Within 24 hours, the streets of Paris were choked with massive improvised barricades made of overturned carts, chopped down trees, and paving stones. The military hesitated. The government collapsed in a panic. King Louis Philippe literally disguised himself in ordinary clothes and ran for his life, catching a boat to England. A republic was declared in France, and the spark caught the wind. Thanks to the very things Marx had just praised in his manifesto, the new, rapid communication networks of capitalism, like the telegraph and the railway. The news of the French king's spectacular fall traveled across Europe at lightning speed. And suddenly, everybody wanted a revolution. It was an unprecedented continental chain reaction, known to history as the springtime of the peoples. It was as if a massive, invisible pressure valve had suddenly been released. In March, the streets of Vienna exploded, and the terrifying, iron-fisted Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich, the architect of conservative Europe, was forced to flee his palace in a laundry cart. The revolution spread to Milan, to Venice, to Budapest. And then, the ultimate prize, Berlin. Barricades went up in the Prussian capital. The absolute monarch, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV, was so terrified by the violent mobs surrounding his palace that he was forced to step outside, take off his hat, and bow to the corpses of the dead revolutionaries in the street. Kings and emperors were tumbling like dominoes. Back in Brussels, Karl Marx was watching the map of Europe light up with absolute astonishment. He had just written the playbook for this exact scenario, and now the game was being played live. But he didn't get to enjoy the moment for long. The Belgian government, completely terrified that the revolutionary virus was going to cross their borders, initiated a brutal crackdown on any known radicals living in their country. Karl Marx was at the very top of their list. In the dead of night, the Belgian police kicked in the door of the Marx family apartment. They didn't just arrest Karl. In a deliberate act of psychological cruelty, they also arrested his aristocratic wife, Jenny. They dragged her down to the city jail and locked her in a freezing, filthy cell alongside local prostitutes and vagrants. It was a terrifying ordeal that severely traumatized her. After a brief imprisonment, the Belgian authorities gave the Marx family their marching orders. They were permanently expelled from the country, under armed guard. They had nowhere to go, no money, and 3 young children. But serendipity intervened. The newly formed revolutionary government in Paris, the people who had just chased out their king, sent Marx an official invitation, signed by the Minister of the Interior. It essentially read, "The tyranny that banished you is gone. Come back to the land of the free." Marx rushed to Paris. He was welcomed as a returning hero by the underground radical clubs. But Marx, always the brilliant tactician, took one look at the situation in France and realized the real fight was elsewhere. France had already overthrown its king. Germany, however, was still a disorganized mess of competing kingdoms and terrified monarchs. If the working class was going to win the continent, they had to break the Prussian military machine. So, he and Friedrich Engels packed their bags, crossed back into German territory, and headed straight for the industrial city of Cologne. Marx wasn't there to hand out his little green pamphlet. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the Communist Manifesto played almost no role in the actual revolutions of 1848. It had just been printed, the distribution was terrible, and hardly anyone actually read it while the fighting was going on. It was a brilliant document, but it was lost in the chaos of a continent on fire. Instead of passing out books, Marx did what he did best. He started a newspaper. Backed by wealthy liberal investors who wanted to see Germany unified, Marx launched the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, the New Rhenish Gazette. He appointed himself the undisputed dictatorial editor-in-chief. Engels, who was serving as his military correspondent, later joked that the editorial board was a pure dictatorship of Marx. This wasn't an academic journal. It was a weapon. Operating out of an office that was constantly surrounded by nervous police, Marx and his writers carried loaded pistols in their coat pockets. They were writing articles with the smell of gunpowder in the air. Marx used the paper to coordinate strikes, expose the cowardice of the liberal politicians, and demand that the working class take up arms to finish the revolution. He was a man in his absolute element, riding the adrenaline of a collapsing world. But the euphoria of the springtime of the peoples was a dangerous illusion. Marx had written in his manifesto that history was a story of class struggle, and the brutal reality of that struggle was about to rear its ugly head. The revolutions of early 1848 had been successful because the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat, had fought together on the barricades to overthrow the kings. But once the kings were gone, the middle class looked around and realized something terrifying. The workers, who were armed and organized, didn't just want the right to vote. They wanted better wages. They wanted shorter work days, They wanted control over the factories. They wanted a complete redistribution of wealth. The middle-class liberals panicked. They realized they were far more terrified of the poor, starving workers than they were of the old kings. And so the great betrayal began. The alliance shattered. The turning point, the moment that permanently darkened Karl Marx's worldview and cemented his belief that the revolution would have to be violently forced, happened in Paris in June 1848. The new Republican government, controlled by the middle class, decided to shut down the national workshops, a program that provided basic jobs and food for thousands of desperate, unemployed workers. Facing literal starvation, the workers of Paris rose up again. They built new barricades. But this time, they weren't fighting the king's army. They were fighting the new republic. The government sent in General Louis-Eugène Cavaignac with absolute, merciless orders. Over 4 horrifying days known as the June Days, the French military used heavy artillery to blast the working-class neighborhoods of Paris to rubble. It was a slaughter. Over 3,000 workers were killed in the streets. Thousands more were arrested and deported to penal colonies in Algeria. When the news of the June Days reached Marx in Cologne, he was devastated, but completely vindicated. His theory was proven correct in blood. The middle class would never peacefully hand over power to the workers. They would rather blow them to pieces with cannons. The June Days sent a signal across Europe. The counter-revolution had begun. Seeing that the middle class was turning on the workers, the old kings and emperors crawled out of hiding, dusted off their crowns, and reorganized their militaries. The Russian Tsar sent hundreds of thousands of troops to crush the rebellion in Hungary. The Austrian emperor violently retook Vienna, and in Prussia, the king sent his heavily armed cavalry to surround the city of Cologne and shut down the rebellion once and for all. Marx knew the end was near. The investors in his newspaper, terrified by his radicalism and the approaching Prussian army, pulled their funding. The police finally had the excuse they needed. They raided the offices of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung and dragged Marx into a courtroom, charging him with inciting armed rebellion. In February 1849, Marx stood before a jury of middle-class German citizens. He didn't cower. He didn't apologize. Instead, he treated the courtroom like a university lecture hall. For hours, he delivered a brilliant, highly complex, and completely mesmerizing speech about history, economics, and the inevitability of the revolution. He essentially told the jury that the laws they were using to prosecute him were obsolete, because the society that wrote those laws was already dead. He was so charismatic, so intellectually overpowering, that the jury foreman actually stood up, thanked Marx for the highly educational lecture, and completely acquitted him of all charges. It was a stunning legal victory. But it didn't matter. The Prussian government didn't care about the verdict. They simply stripped Marx of his citizenship, declared him an undesirable alien, and ordered him to leave the country immediately. In May 1849, Karl Marx published the final issue of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. In a brilliant, theatrical stroke of defiance, he used up all the red ink in the printing shop. The final issue was printed entirely in blood red. In his final editorial, he promised the government that this was not a surrender. "Our last word will always and everywhere be the emancipation of the working class." But words couldn't stop bullets. The revolutions of 1848 were entirely crushed. The kings were back on their thrones. The radical leaders were either dead, in prison, or running for their lives. Marx, now 31 years old, was a man without a country, permanently exiled from Germany, kicked out of Belgium, and hunted by the secret police of half a dozen empires. He tried to take refuge in Paris again, but the French government gave him a grim ultimatum. He could either move to a malaria-infested swamp in the remote French countryside, or he could get out of the country altogether. He chose the latter. With no money, a pregnant wife, and his dreams of immediate global revolution lying in ashes, Karl Marx boarded a ferry crossing the English Channel. He was heading to the only place left on Earth that would take him. A cold, foggy, sprawling capitalist metropolis where he would be entirely isolated, entirely forgotten, and plunged into a living nightmare. He was heading to London. The year was 1849. When Karl Marx stepped off the ferry and vanished into the thick, choking fog of London, he believed it was only a temporary retreat. He thought he would stay for a few months, wait for the political heat on the continent to die down, and then return to Germany to lead the next revolution. He was wrong. He would never live in his homeland again. London wasn't a temporary stopover. It was going to be his permanent purgatory. To understand the irony of Karl Marx's life, you have to look at where he ended up. London in the mid-19th century was the undisputed, beating heart of global capitalism. It was the wealthiest, most powerful city on the face of the earth, ruling over a vast empire. The Thames River was choked with ships bringing in sugar, cotton, and gold. But Marx and his family didn't experience the wealth of the British Empire. They experienced its dark, rotting underbelly. Because they had absolutely no money, the Marx family was forced to move into the notorious, disease-ridden slums of Soho, renting 2 tiny, cramped rooms on the top floor of 28 Dean Street. Forget the romantic image of the starving artist. The reality of 28 Dean Street was a waking nightmare. Soho was essentially an open sewer. The streets outside were piled with horse manure and rotting garbage. The air inside the apartment was thick with the smell of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the cheap, foul-smelling cigars that Marx chain-smoked from the moment he woke up until the moment he finally collapsed into bed. For the man who had just declared war on the entire capitalist class, the daily reality of his life was an agonizing, humiliating struggle for pennies. Marx was utterly incapable of managing money. When he did occasionally get a small advance from an article or a smuggled cash gift from his wealthy friend Friedrich Engels, he would immediately blow it. He would buy expensive cigars, pay off 1 or 2 angry creditors just to get them to stop banging on the door, or buy a round of drinks for other exiled revolutionaries. Within days, the money would be gone, and the crushing, suffocating poverty would return. The burden of this chaotic survival fell almost entirely on his wife, Jenny. The former aristocratic it girl of Trier, who had grown up in ballrooms and sprawling estates, was now living in a biohazard zone, fighting off the landlord on a daily basis. Their lives revolved around the pawn shop. When they couldn't pay for bread, Jenny would wrap up her silver family heirlooms, the only things she had left from her noble childhood, and pawn them. When the silver was gone, they pawned their clothes. There were literally weeks where Karl Marx, the great champion of the working man, could not physically leave the apartment because he had pawned his only pair of winter trousers just to buy a few days' worth of food. He would sit in his freezing room, wrapped in a blanket, frantically writing. The stress was unimaginable. Creditors and debt collectors literally camped outside their door. Marx gave his children strict instructions. Whenever someone knocked, they were to open the door just a crack and lie, saying, "Mr. Marx is not upstairs." But the poverty wasn't just humiliating, it was lethal. This is the darkest, most agonizing chapter of Marx's life, the devastating human cost of his obsession. In his relentless drive to cure the suffering of humanity, he was entirely unable to protect his own family from the very things he was fighting against. In the slums of Victorian London, child mortality was brutally high. Disease tore through the neighborhood. Over the course of their time in London, Karl and Jenny would experience a parent's ultimate nightmare, not once, but repeatedly. In 1850, their infant son, Guido, died suddenly in his sleep. A year later, Jenny gave birth to a daughter, Franziska. She survived for just 1 year before contracting severe bronchitis. The family was so utterly destitute when Franziska died that they couldn't even afford to bury her. Jenny, paralyzed by grief, had to beg a French neighbor for £2 just to buy a cheap wooden coffin so she could lay her baby daughter to rest. But the most crushing blow came in 1855. Marx's favorite child, a bright, energetic 8-year-old boy named Edgar, affectionately nicknamed Mush, contracted a severe gastrointestinal illness. For weeks, Marx sat by the boy's bedside, watching helplessly as his son wasted away. When Edgar finally died in his father's arms, something inside Karl Marx permanently broke. The fierce, arrogant, combative philosopher was reduced to a hollow, weeping shell of a man. In a heartbreaking letter to Engels, Marx wrote, "The house is naturally completely desolate and deserted since the death of the dear child who was its life and soul. I have suffered every kind of misfortune, but I have only just learned what real unhappiness is. In the midst of all the terrible torments I have recently experienced, the thought of you and your friendship has always kept me going. It was a tragedy that would have destroyed most men. It would have convinced anyone else to give up the radical politics, go get a normal job as a clerk or a translator, and simply try to survive." But Marx refused to surrender. He believed with terrifying, absolute certainty that he was right, and that his work was the only thing that could stop this kind of suffering from happening to millions of other families. So, instead of breaking, he buried his grief in a cold, obsessive rage. And ironically, while Marx was hitting rock bottom, struggling to find money for funerals and bread, the most powerful empires in Europe were still absolutely terrified of him. They didn't see a grieving, pathetic man sitting in a slum. They saw a dormant volcano. The Prussian government, the Austrian Empire, and the French police all maintained active intelligence files on Marx. They coordinated with the British authorities to keep him under constant surveillance. Spies were routinely dispatched to Soho to figure out what the author of the Communist Manifesto was plotting. Thanks to the meticulously kept police records of the 19th century, we actually have an incredibly rare, first-hand account of what it was like to walk into Karl Marx's living room during this dark period. In 1852, a Prussian secret police spy, likely a man named Wilhelm Stieber, managed to infiltrate Marx's inner circle and gain access to the Dean Street apartment. The official intelligence report he sent back to the King of Prussia reads like a script from a gritty, underground movie. The spy was entirely disgusted by the chaos, but also deeply unnerved by Marx's presence. The spy wrote, He lives in one of the worst, therefore one of the cheapest quarters of London. He occupies 2 rooms. In the whole apartment there is not one clean and solid piece of furniture. Everything is broken, tattered and torn, with thick dust over everything and the greatest untidiness everywhere. The report vividly described the overwhelming clutter. Manuscripts piled high, books stacked on every available surface, children's toys scattered amongst broken teacups, dirty spoons, and cheap, unwashed clothes. Washing, grooming, and changing his linen are things he does rarely, the spy noted with aristocratic disgust. He is often drunk. Though he is often idle for days on end, he will work day and night with tireless endurance when he has a great deal of work to do. But the most telling part of the spy's report was how he described interacting with Marx and his wife. When the spy sat down in the living room, he was offered a chair with only 3 legs. While he awkwardly tried to balance on it, Marx and Jenny treated the entire situation with bizarre, almost terrifying hospitality. Despite the crushing poverty, the dirt, and the smell of tobacco, the spy noted that they acted as if they were royalty holding court. To sit down becomes a thoroughly dangerous business, the spy warned his superiors. But all these things do not in the least embarrass Marx or his wife. You are received in the most friendly way and cordially offered pipes and tobacco and whatever else there may happen to be. You eventually become accustomed to the company and find it interesting and original. This report perfectly encapsulates the paradox of Karl Marx in the 1850s. The Prussian secret police were reading this dispatch in their pristine, gilded palaces in Berlin, terrified of a man who didn't even own a functioning chair. They were right to be afraid. Because despite the dead children, the pawnbrokers, the hunger, and the filth of Dean Street, Marx was not defeated. He was simply changing his strategy. He realized that writing quick, angry pamphlets like the Manifesto wasn't going to bring down the capitalist machine. To destroy the beast, he needed to understand its exact anatomy. He was done with street protests and secret societies. He was about to take the war to a completely different battlefield, one far quieter, but ultimately much more dangerous. He was going to spend the next 2 decades locked inside a library. To escape the suffocating, disease-ridden squalor of his cramped Soho apartment, Karl Marx needed a sanctuary. He needed a place where the debt collectors couldn't find him, where the cries of his hungry children wouldn't break his concentration, and where he could finally build the ultimate weapon to destroy the system that was crushing him. He found that sanctuary under the massive, breathtaking, glass-paneled dome of the British Museum Reading Room. If you visit London today, you can still see the spectacular circular room where the modern world was effectively dismantled on paper. In the 1850s, it was the greatest repository of human knowledge on the planet. It was utterly silent, smelling of leather bindings, dust, and floor wax. And every single morning, 6 days a week, right when the heavy wooden doors opened at 9 a.m., a broad-shouldered, heavily bearded man in a threadbare coat would walk in, claim his regular spot at desk row G, or sometimes O, and sit down. He would not leave until the guards physically forced him out at 7 p.m., when the library closed. This became Karl Marx's life for over a decade. He wasn't just reading. He was conducting a massive surgical autopsy on the global economy. He had realized that the fiery, poetic rhetoric of the Communist Manifesto was not enough. You couldn't just yell at the capitalist machine to stop. You had to understand exactly how the gears turned, where the fuel came from, and precisely where to throw the wrench to blow the whole thing apart. His daily routine in the reading room was an exercise in terrifying obsession. He wasn't reading philosophy or poetry anymore. He was consuming mountains of the driest, most boring, and most horrifying documents ever printed, the British parliamentary blue books. These were the official, internal government reports written by British factory inspectors. Because the British government was actually trying to regulate the worst abuses of the Industrial Revolution, they sent inspectors into the coal mines, the textile mills, and the matchstick factories to document the working conditions. The capitalists essentially wrote their own confession, and Marx was sitting in the library, taking notes. He sat in absolute silence, reading clinical government-stamped reports about 9-year-old boys working in total darkness in coal mines until their spines permanently deformed. He read about women in textile mills working 16-hour shifts until they collapsed into the deafening mechanical looms. He studied the exact penny-by-penny calculations of how a factory owner priced a loaf of bread versus the wage of the baker who made it. Marx realized he didn't need to invent anything. He didn't need to rely on emotion. He was going to use the capitalists' own meticulous bookkeeping to hang them. He was gathering the cold, hard data to prove his ultimate theory, the concept of surplus value. He wanted to prove, mathematically, that the entire system of profit was just a polite, modern word for theft. The boss wasn't paying the worker for the value of their work. The boss was paying the worker just enough to keep them alive so they could come back to work the next day. The difference between those two numbers, the surplus, was the profit, and it was soaked in blood. But compiling this massive, multi-volume masterpiece was destroying Marx physically. The human body is not designed to sit in a wooden chair for 10 hours a day, survive on a diet of cheap potatoes and heavily processed bread, drink excessive amounts of cheap beer, and chain smoke highly toxic, cheap cigars. Marx's health completely collapsed. He began to suffer from severe liver problems, excruciating toothaches, and agonizing eye inflammation from staring at tiny text in poor lighting. But the most horrifying and ironically symbolic physical ailment he suffered was a severe, chronic outbreak of carbuncles, massive, deeply infected boils that covered his body. These weren't just standard pimples. They were agonizing, festering wounds that broke out across his chest, his back, and worst of all, his posterior. The pain was so blinding that Marx literally could not sit down. The man who was trying to write the heaviest, most dense book in the history of economics was forced to write it while standing up, or lying on his side on his living room floor, often bleeding through his clothes. He had to take razor blades to lance the boils himself just to relieve the pressure. In his letters, Marx's dark, morbid sense of humor bled through the agony. He viewed his physical rotting as a direct result of the capitalist system he was studying. In a letter to his friend, he famously snarled, "I hope the bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles until their dying day." He literally believed he was writing his book in his own blood. And speaking of his friend, none of this, not the library hours, not the survival of his family, not the writing of the book, would have been possible without the greatest, most tragic irony of the 19th century. Friedrich Engels. While Marx was sitting in the quiet dome of the British Museum, Engels was living in his own personal hell in Manchester. To keep Marx alive, to pay for the ink, the paper, the rent in Soho, and the medical bills for the carbuncles, Engels had been forced to surrender to his father. He went back to work as a senior manager at the Ehrman and Engels textile mill. The co-author of the Communist Manifesto was spending his days walking the factory floor, managing the books, maximizing profits, and exploiting the workers. He absolutely despised it. He referred to it in his letters as filthy dog's commerce. But every month, Engels would take the blood money he had squeezed from the Manchester factory workers and quietly wire it to London, effectively funding the creation of the book designed to destroy people exactly like himself. Engels sacrificed his own intellectual career and a large chunk of his soul so that Marx could write. But even with Engels' financial lifeline, getting Marx to actually finish the book was like pulling teeth. Marx's chronic procrastination, which had almost derailed the manifesto years earlier, returned with a vengeance. The scope of his project was completely out of control. Originally, he thought it would take a few months to write a short pamphlet on economics. Months turned into years. Years turned into a decade. Engels would write desperate letters from Manchester. "How is the book coming? You said it would be done by spring." Marx would reply with a tidal wave of excuses. He couldn't finish the chapter on rent until he had taught himself fluent Russian, so he could read obscure agricultural reports from St. Petersburg. He couldn't finish the chapter on machinery until he had fully studied the history of mathematics and calculus. His perfectionism was a disease. He was trying to swallow the entire universe of human knowledge and compress it into a single book. Years dragged on. The American Civil War broke out, and Marx took a side gig writing articles for the New York Tribune. Yes, Karl Marx was briefly a foreign correspondent for an American newspaper, just to make extra cash. But the great book languished. Finally, by the mid-1860s, Engels essentially staged an intervention. He demanded the manuscript. He didn't care if it was perfect. He just needed it printed before one of them died of stress or liver failure. Reluctantly, agonizingly, Marx began to pull the chaotic thousands of pages of notes into a cohesive structure. He worked through the nights, surrounded by a cloud of thick blue cigar smoke, his body covered in bandages. In the spring of 1867, 16 years after he first walked into the British Museum reading room, Marx packed a massive, heavy stack of handwritten papers into a trunk. He boarded a ship across the North Sea to Hamburg, Germany, to personally deliver the manuscript to a publisher. He was nearly 50 years old. His hair and legendary beard had turned completely white. He looked like an exhausted, broken biblical prophet. In September 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital, Capital, a critique of political economy, was finally published. It was a staggering achievement. It was a dense 3,000-page, eventually, once all volumes were compiled, labyrinth of economic theory, history, and Gothic horror. Marx famously used the metaphor of a vampire to describe the system. "Capital is dead labor," he wrote, "that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks." He laid out the mechanics of how the system would eventually destroy itself. He argued that capitalism demands infinite growth on a finite planet. Capitalists would constantly compete, pushing wages lower and lower, replacing workers with machines, until the working class was so impoverished that they couldn't afford to buy the very products the factories were making. The markets would crash, monopolies would consolidate, and eventually, the massive, desperate, unified working class would simply step up and take over the highly organized machinery of production. Marx waited for the explosion. He waited for the book to hit the capitals of Europe like a nuclear bomb. He returned to London, sat back, and listened for the revolution. But all he heard was silence. When Das Kapital was first released, it was a massive, humiliating flop. It was too long. It was too dense. The math was too complicated, and the philosophical language was impenetrable for the average, exhausted factory worker. Most of the mainstream newspapers completely ignored it. Even some of his closest socialist allies admitted they couldn't get past the first chapter on the theory of commodities. Marx was utterly deflated. He had sacrificed his health, his sanity, and arguably the lives of his children to write a book that seemed destined to gather dust on the shelves of a few obscure radical bookstores. He would spend the rest of his life tinkering with the subsequent volumes, never actually finishing them. When Karl Marx died in his armchair in 1883, stateless, plagued by illness, and relatively obscure, it looked like the story was over. It looked like the capitalist machine had won, and the grumpy old man in the library had been completely forgotten by history. But ideas are practically impossible to kill. Das Kapital wasn't a failure. It was a delayed fuse time bomb. The author was dead, but the weapon he had spent 10,000 hours forging in the British Museum was just waiting for the right person to pick it up. And, as the 19th century bled into the 20th, someone was about to pick it up and aim it directly at the heart of the world. By the early 1880s, the fire that had driven Karl Marx to challenge the empires of Europe was finally burning out. The man who had spent his life meticulously dissecting the capitalist machine was now physically and emotionally shattered. The final years of his life were a cascade of personal tragedies. In 1881, his beloved wife Jenny, the aristocratic it girl who had abandoned her castles to live out of suitcases and hide from secret police with him, died of liver cancer. Marx was so violently ill with bronchitis at the time that his doctors physically forbade him from attending her funeral. He was confined to his bed, weeping for the woman who had held his chaotic life together. Less than 2 years later, in January 1883, he received a blow from which he would never recover. His eldest daughter, Jenny, suddenly died of bladder cancer at the age of 38. When Friedrich Engels came to visit Marx after hearing the news, he took one look at his old friend and realized it was over. "The Moor is dead," Engels quietly told a mutual friend. Marx's body was still breathing, but his spirit had been completely extinguished. On the afternoon of March 14, 1883, Marx's housekeeper went upstairs to check on him. She found him sitting quietly in his favorite armchair in his London study. He had slipped away in his sleep. He was 64 years old. 3 days later, on a dreary, wet Saturday, Karl Marx was buried in a remote corner of Highgate Cemetery in North London. If you were to look at that funeral as the final scene of his life, you would conclude that Karl Marx was a monumental, historic failure. There were no massive crowds of weeping factory workers. There were no riots in the streets. There were no terrified kings reading the obituaries. In fact, only 11 people showed up. It was a pathetic, deeply lonely gathering. Besides Engels, there were a few family members, a couple of aging socialist friends from his radical days in Germany, and a French biologist. The global capitalist press barely registered his passing. The Times of London didn't even print an original obituary. They just ran a tiny, delayed blurb they had copied from a French newspaper. The man who had written the Communist Manifesto went into the ground almost completely unnoticed by the world he had tried to conquer. Standing over the muddy grave, Friedrich Engels delivered a short eulogy. To the few people listening, his words probably sounded like the desperate, delusional, wishful thinking of a grieving best friend. "His name will endure through the ages," Engels proclaimed to the empty cemetery, "and so also will his work." It was a nice sentiment. But in reality, Marx's work was a catastrophic, disorganized mess. When Engels walked back into Marx's study at 41 Maitland Park Road to sort through his friend's belongings, he was confronted with an absolute nightmare. Marx had published the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867, promising that volumes 2 and 3 were right around the corner. But when Engels opened Marx's desk drawers, he realized the horrifying truth. There were no finished books. Instead, there was a literal mountain of scattered, ink-stained, coffee-ringed paper. Marx had spent the last 15 years of his life spiraling into endless, obsessive research tangents, filling hundreds of notebooks with a chaotic mix of German, English, French, and Russian. Worse, Marx's handwriting was famously atrocious, a tiny, jagged, illegible scrawl that looked like crushed spiders. He often used his own invented shorthand, crossing things out and writing in the margins until the pages were black with ink. If Engels had simply packed those papers into a box and donated them to a library, Karl Marx would have been largely forgotten by history. An obscure, eccentric 19th-century economist who wrote one good pamphlet and half of a dense, unreadable book. But Engels made a different choice. And in doing so, he pulled off the greatest, most consequential public relations campaign in the history of the world. Engels, who was now in his 60s and financially comfortable from his days managing his father's textile mills, completely abandoned his own retirement plans. He made it his sole mission to resurrect Karl Marx from the dead. For the next 12 years, Engels sat at a desk and subjected himself to the agonizing, mind-numbing task of decoding Marx's hieroglyphics. He ruined his failing eyesight, staring at the scribbles. He acted as an editor, a ghostwriter, and an archaeologist, piecing together the fragmented thoughts of a dead genius. He meticulously structured, heavily edited, and finally published Volume 2 of Das Kapital in 1885 and Volume 3 in 1894. But Engels didn't just publish books. He realized that if he wanted Marx's ideas to actually trigger a global revolution, he couldn't rely on Das Kapital. It was way too long, the math was too hard, and the average exhausted factory worker was never going to read it. So Engels became a translator, not just translating the words from German to English or French, but translating the ideas from dense academic theory into sharp, accessible, explosive propaganda. Engels wrote a series of incredibly popular, highly readable books and essays, most notably Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, that summarized Marx's massive, complex worldview into bite-sized, easy-to-understand concepts. In doing so, Engels effectively invented Marxism. He took the chaotic, constantly shifting and often contradictory thoughts of his friend and packaged them into a rigid, cohesive, almost religious doctrine. He built the brand. And then he marketed it. Operating out of his London townhouse, Engels became the undisputed international godfather of the socialist movement. The late 19th century was a time of massive industrial expansion, and millions of workers were joining new labor unions and socialist political parties. They were hungry for an ideology, a banner to rally behind. Engels gave them Marx. He wrote thousands of letters to radical leaders in Germany, France, Italy, and the United States. He funded socialist newspapers. Whenever a debate broke out among leftists in Europe, they would write to Engels, asking him what the master would have thought. Engels would issue a ruling, speaking with the authority of Marx's ghost. His greatest success was in Marx's homeland. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, rapidly grew into the largest, most powerful political party in the country, and they officially adopted Marxism as their guiding ideology. They printed millions of cheap, mass-market copies of the Communist Manifesto and distributed them in factories and taverns. Engels lived just long enough to see the resurrection complete. Before he died of throat cancer in 1895, he attended an international socialist congress in Europe. When the aging, wealthy industrialist walked onto the stage, thousands of working-class delegates stood up and roared with applause. They were cheering for Engels, but more importantly, they were cheering for the system he had built in the name of his dead friend. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was absolute. The grumpy, boil-covered man who couldn't afford his own rent had been completely erased from public memory. In his place stood a towering, mythical prophet. His face, the massive forehead, the fierce eyes, the iconic white beard, was printed on red banners and carried through the streets by millions of marching workers. The 11 people at the muddy grave in Highgate had multiplied into a global army. Karl Marx had been successfully weaponized on paper. But as the 1800s gave way to the 1900s, the world was about to discover what happens when you take those papers out of the library, hand them to men with actual guns, and pull the trigger. The theory was finished. The bloodiest, most terrifying social experiment in human history was about to begin. When the 20th century dawned, Karl Marx had been dead for nearly 20 years. His bones were resting quietly beneath the mud of Highgate Cemetery. But thanks to Friedrich Engels' relentless, masterful public relations campaign, Marx's ideas had practically become a religion for the European working class. Millions of exhausted factory workers, coal miners, and dock hands from London to St. Petersburg were reading his words, singing socialist anthems, and waiting for the inevitable collapse of capitalism. But there was a massive, frustrating problem. Marx had promised that the revolution was a scientific certainty. He had argued that capitalism would naturally destroy itself. But as the 1900s rolled in, the capitalist empires of Europe weren't collapsing. In fact, they were getting stronger, richer, and more heavily armed than ever before. They were building dreadnought battleships, expanding their colonial empires, and inventing new, terrifying technologies. The socialist leaders of Europe were getting comfortable. They were winning seats in parliaments, negotiating for 8-hour workdays, and generally becoming part of the system Marx had told them to destroy. It looked like Marx's apocalyptic vision was just a fantasy. If you wanted to tear down the empires of the world, a book, even a brilliant, terrifying book like Das Kapital, was not enough. Ideas, no matter how powerful, are just ink on paper. To actually change the map of the world, someone had to figure out how to take those ideas, load them into a gun, and pull the trigger. That trigger was finally pulled in the summer of 1914, The outbreak of the First World War shattered the globe. It was a mechanized, apocalyptic meat grinder that Marx himself couldn't have imagined in his darkest nightmares. Millions of young men, the very working-class proletarians Marx had told to unite, were instead putting on national uniforms and machine-gunning each other to pieces in the muddy, rat-infested trenches of France, Belgium, and Russia. By 1917, the German Empire was bleeding out. They were fighting a brutal, unwinnable two-front war. In the West, they were locked in a horrific stalemate against the British and the French. In the East, they were fighting the massive, seemingly endless armies of the Russian Tsar. The German High Command, led by conservative aristocratic generals like Erich Ludendorff, realized they were running out of time and men. If they didn't knock Russia out of the war soon, Germany would be completely crushed. But they couldn't beat the Russian army with bullets alone. The Russian Empire was simply too vast. The German generals needed a miracle. They needed a way to destroy Russia from the inside out. Enter one of the most shadowy, fascinating, and overlooked figures in 20th century history. Alexander Parvus. Parvus was a walking contradiction. He was a brilliant Russian Marxist, a former revolutionary, and an associate of the socialist underground. But he was also a fabulously wealthy, morally bankrupt arms dealer who loved expensive cigars, champagne, and high society prostitutes. He operated in the shadowy gray zones of European intelligence. In early 1915, Parvus walked into the German Foreign Office in Berlin with an unbelievable pitch. He sat down with the ultra-conservative, monocle-wearing aristocrats of the German Empire and essentially said, "I know how you can destroy the Russian Tsar without firing a single shot." His proposal was a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. Parvus pointed out that the Russian Empire was highly unstable. The peasants were starving, and the soldiers were dying by the millions. The entire country was a powder keg, desperately waiting for a spark. Parvus told the German government that they didn't need to send more troops to the Eastern Front. Instead, they needed to weaponize Karl Marx. Parvus suggested that the German Empire, the ultimate hyper-capitalist military state, should secretly fund, arm, and organize the most radical, violent, extreme Marxist revolutionaries they could find, and unleash them inside Russia. It was the geopolitical equivalent of dropping a biological weapon behind enemy lines. The German High Command, men who absolutely despised socialism and would gladly execute any Marxist caught in Germany, loved the idea. They didn't care about the philosophy. They only cared about winning the war. They gave Parvus a massive blank check budget of millions of gold marks to start funding Russian radicals. But to make the bomb go off, they needed a detonator. They needed a man ruthless enough, brilliant enough, and fanatical enough to actually pull off a coup d'etat against the largest empire on Earth. They found him sitting in a quiet, boring library in Zurich, Switzerland. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, but the world would soon know him by his underground alias, Lenin. Lenin was the ultimate mutation of Karl Marx's ideology. If Marx was the architect who drew the blueprints, Lenin was the demolition expert holding the dynamite. Lenin had read Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto with a religious, terrifying obsession. But Lenin fundamentally disagreed with Marx on one crucial point. Marx believed that the revolution would happen naturally, led by a massive, spontaneous uprising of the working class. Lenin looked at the working class and scoffed. He believed that the average factory worker was too tired, too uneducated, and too easily distracted to ever pull off a real revolution. Lenin argued that you couldn't wait for history to happen naturally. You had to force it. You needed a vanguard, a small, highly disciplined, ruthless, heavily armed cult of professional revolutionaries who would seize power by force, in the name of the workers, whether the workers wanted it or not. His faction was called the Bolsheviks. In early 1917, Lenin was pacing his small apartment in neutral Switzerland like a caged tiger. The situation in Russia was deteriorating rapidly. In February, a spontaneous, messy revolution had actually broken out in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. The Tsar had been forced to abdicate, and a weak, temporary democratic government had taken over. Lenin was furious. The Russian Empire was collapsing. The greatest political vacuum in history was opening up, and he was stuck in Switzerland, completely cut off by the battlefields of World War I. He was literally surrounded by enemy armies. There was absolutely no way for him to physically get back to Russia to seize control of the chaos. Until the German Secret Service knocked on his door. The Germans knew exactly who Lenin was. They knew he was a fanatic who wanted to immediately pull Russia out of the World War if he took power. The German logic was chillingly simple. Help this Marxist fanatic get back to Petrograd. Let him overthrow the Russian government. Russia drops out of the war, and Germany wins. They approached Lenin through intermediaries and offered him a deal that sounds like a script from a Cold War spy thriller. They would provide a highly secure private train to transport Lenin and 31 of his most radical Bolshevik operatives directly across Germany to the coast, where they could catch a ferry to Sweden and then a train down into Russia. Lenin, who had spent his entire life denouncing capitalist empires, didn't hesitate for a second. He was a pragmatist. If the German emperor wanted to give him the rope to hang the Russian bourgeoisie, Lenin was more than happy to take it. But the logistics of the trip were intensely dangerous. Lenin was terrified that if the Russian public found out he had traveled back home with the help of the German military, he would be executed for high treason as a German spy. So he insisted on a bizarre, highly theatrical condition. The train had to be extraterritorial. In April 1917, Lenin and his operatives boarded a single green-painted wooden train car in Switzerland. The moment the train crossed the border into Germany, the doors were locked. The German military guards were strictly forbidden from speaking to the Russians inside. To physically separate the two groups, Lenin actually took a piece of white chalk and drew a line across the floor of the train corridor. On one side were the armed German soldiers. On the other side were the Russian Marxists. No one was allowed to cross the chalk line. Winston Churchill later described this terrifying, historic train ride with absolute, poetic brilliance. He wrote that the German High Command had transported Lenin in a sealed truck, like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. It was the perfect metaphor. The train was a test tube, and inside it was a highly infectious, deadly ideological virus, cultivated from the dusty books of Karl Marx, synthesized by the ruthless mind of Lenin, and delivered by the military machinery of the German Empire. The journey took 8 days. On the night of April 16, 1917, the train finally pulled into the Finland station in Petrograd. The German High Command waited nervously to see if their biological weapon would actually work. When Lenin stepped off the train, he wasn't arrested. He wasn't shot for treason. Instead, He was greeted by thousands of cheering workers, soldiers, and sailors holding red torches. A military band played the Marseillaise. He climbed on top of an armored car, stared out at the chaotic, starving, desperate masses of the Russian capital, and unleashed the full, terrifying power of Marxist rhetoric. He didn't give them a lecture on complex economic surplus value. He gave them a slogan that hit like a physical blow: peace, land, and bread. He promised the soldiers an immediate end to the bloody World War. He promised the starving peasants that they could violently seize the land from the wealthy aristocrats. And he promised the starving cities that the wealthy would be stripped of their resources to feed the poor. The virus had been unleashed. The German plan worked flawlessly. In fact, it worked far too well. Over the next 6 months, Lenin and his Bolsheviks relentlessly undermined the fragile democratic government. They formed armed militias. They infiltrated the military. And in October 1917, they struck. In a swift, relatively bloodless, highly organized coup d'etat, Lenin's heavily armed operatives seized the telegraph offices, the railway stations, and the Winter Palace. Almost overnight, a small group of radical intellectuals had successfully hijacked the largest nation on the planet. For the very first time in human history, the ideas of Karl Marx had been ripped out of the library and installed into the absolute machinery of a state. Lenin immediately abolished private property, nationalized the banks, and created a ruthless secret police force, the Cheka, to hunt down, torture, and execute anyone who opposed the new order. The era of writing philosophical manifestos was officially over. The era of the firing squad had begun. The German generals popped champagne. They had won the Eastern Front. Lenin, true to his word, immediately signed a humiliating peace treaty with Germany, pulling Russia out of World War I. The German Empire transferred millions of troops to the West, thinking they had just achieved a masterstroke of geopolitical genius. But the German High Command had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They thought they could control the Marxist virus. They thought it would only destroy Russia and then politely die out. They didn't understand the fundamental nature of Karl Marx's ideas. The Communist Manifesto didn't say, "Working men of Russia, unite." It said, "Working men of all countries, unite." Within a year, the German Empire itself would completely collapse, its own sailors and soldiers mutinying in the streets of Berlin, waving the exact same red flags that the Germans had just paid Lenin to wave in Russia. The German emperor was forced to run for his life. The biological weapon had blown back. The specter that Marx had written about in 1848 was no longer a ghost haunting Europe. It was a massive, heavily armed reality, sitting in the Kremlin, looking out at a shattered world preparing to spread its fire to every corner of the globe. When Vladimir Lenin's heart gave out in 1924, the Soviet Union he left behind was a brutal totalitarian fortress. Under his successor, Joseph Stalin, Karl Marx's dream of a workers' utopia was completely transformed into a mechanized meat grinder of secret police, gulags, and state-engineered famines. But despite the horrors unfolding inside Russia, the Marxist virus had officially proven that it could infect and conquer a massive empire. And viruses, by their very nature, do not stay contained. They mutate, they cross borders, and they spread. As the 20th century burned through its middle decades, the phantom that Marx had conjured in the foggy slums of London was about to go global. But to conquer the rest of the world, the ideology had to adapt. Marx had always insisted that the communist revolution could only happen in highly advanced, industrialized capitalist nations, places like England, Germany, or the United States, where there were millions of factory workers. He had openly despised rural peasants, viewing them as uneducated and politically useless. Lenin had bent this rule a little to conquer Russia. But the next man to pick up the book was about to completely shatter Marx's rules and rewrite them in blood. Thousands of miles away from the snowy domes of Moscow, in the sprawling, ancient, and deeply impoverished agrarian landscape of China, a young assistant librarian named Mao Zedong was reading translated copies of the Communist Manifesto. Mao looked at his country and realized a glaring problem with Marx's strict blueprint. China didn't have massive, modern factory cities. It didn't have a vast, organized proletariat working on assembly lines. China was a nation of hundreds of millions of starving, exhausted, heavily exploited farmers who were working the land exactly as they had for thousands of years. If Mao waited for China to industrialize the way Marx commanded, he would be waiting for a century. So Mao committed the ultimate Marxist heresy. He swapped the protagonist of the story. Mao decided that the revolution didn't need factory workers. It needed peasants. He looked at the vast, impoverished countryside and saw an ocean of untapped, explosive rage. Through the 1930s and 40s, Mao Zedong led a relentless, horrifyingly brutal guerrilla war. He didn't build his movement in the cities. He built it in the mountains and the rice paddies. He took Marx's concept of class warfare and weaponized it for the village level, encouraging poor farmers to violently rise up, drag their wealthy landlords into the town squares, and beat them to death. It was a complete mutation of the original ideology, but it was incredibly, terrifyingly effective. In 1949, after surviving the grueling, legendary Long March and defeating the nationalist forces, Mao stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Karl Marx, a German philosopher who had barely ever left Western Europe, was now the ideological godfather to a quarter of the human race. The red flag was flying over the largest population on Earth. But the contagion didn't stop in Asia. It was about to jump the Pacific Ocean and land directly in the backyard of the ultimate capitalist superpower, the United States. In the 1950s, the aesthetic of the Marxist revolution shifted again. It moved from the freezing winters of Russia and the vast plains of China to the steamy, dense jungles of Latin America. And here, the revolution found its ultimate romanticized poster boy. Ernesto Che Guevara was an asthmatic, middle-class medical student from Argentina. He wasn't born a killer. But after taking a legendary motorcycle trip across the South American continent, Che came face to face with the crushing poverty, the diseased copper miners, and the ruthless exploitation of Latin America by massive American-owned corporations like the United Fruit Company. Che realized that giving out aspirin wasn't going to cure the continent. He needed a stronger medicine. He found it in the writings of Karl Marx. Che Guevara fully embraced Marx's theory that capitalism was an international vampire, sucking the blood of the developing world to feed the wealthy empires of the West. But Che didn't just want to write angry newspaper articles like Marx did. Che wanted to burn the vampire to the ground. He traded his medical bag for an M1 Garand rifle and headed for the Sierra Maestra mountains of Cuba. There, he joined forces with a charismatic cigar-chomping lawyer named Fidel Castro. Together, they took Marx's dense 3,000-page economic theories and turned them into the ultimate romantic outlaw aesthetic. They grew their hair long, wore olive-green combat fatigues, and launched a daring, seemingly impossible guerrilla war against the U.S.-backed Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista. When Castro and Che rode their tanks into Havana in 1959, victorious, it sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. The Marxist virus had established a heavily armed beachhead just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And this is where the sheer, mind-bending absurdity of Karl Marx's legacy reaches its absolute peak. By the early 1960s, the entire planet had been fractured in half by an idea. The globe was physically and psychologically split into two heavily armed camps. On one side was the capitalist West, led by the United States, championing free markets, private property, and liberal democracy. On the other side was the communist bloc, a massive red monolith stretching from the Berlin Wall all the way to the East China Sea, claiming to fight for the working class and the total abolition of private wealth. This was the Cold War. It was the most dangerous, high-stakes standoff in the history of the human species. Think about the sheer scale of what was happening. Superpowers were spending trillions upon trillions of dollars building vast networks of spies, launching satellites into the freezing vacuum of space, and constructing massive fleets of nuclear submarines that prowled the deep oceans. In the United States, school children were being taught to hide under their wooden desks in case of a nuclear flash. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Soviet Union secretly shipped nuclear ballistic missiles to Castro's Cuba. For 13 agonizing days, the world stood entirely still, hovering just millimeters away from total apocalyptic annihilation. The United States and the Soviet Union each had their fingers hovering over buttons that would launch thousands of nuclear warheads, incinerating billions of people and effectively ending human civilization. And why? Why was the world pushed to the absolute brink of nuclear Armageddon? It wasn't over a religious holy land. It wasn't over a stolen king's crown. It wasn't over a biological resource. The entire planet was held hostage over an argument about economics. Half the world had organized its entire military, cultural, and political existence around the theories scribbled down by a grumpy, boil-covered cigar-smoking man sitting in the British Museum a century earlier. The words Marx had struggled to write while his family starved in the slums of Soho had literally become the operating system for half of the globe. The ideas had taken on a terrifying life of their own. Marx had written that the workers of the world must unite to throw off their chains. But in the 20th century, the attempt to force that utopia into existence resulted in the creation of new, far heavier chains. In the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and beyond, the Marxist-Leninist regimes resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people through political purges, forced labor camps, and catastrophic state-planned famines. The dream of a classless society had mutated into a nightmare of absolute state control. Yet the idea was incredibly seductive. Throughout the Cold War, from the jungles of Vietnam to the savannas of Angola, young men and women picked up AK-47 assault rifles and died in the mud, genuinely believing they were fighting for the liberation of humanity, quoting the Communist Manifesto with their dying breaths. Karl Marx had successfully split the world in two. For nearly 50 years, the Berlin Wall stood as a physical monument to his ideology, a concrete scar carved directly through the heart of Europe, lined with barbed wire, landmines, and sniper towers, separating the capitalist West from the communist East. To the capitalists, Marx was the architect of the ultimate evil, a philosopher of envy and mass murder. To the revolutionaries in the jungles, he was a flawless prophet who had cracked the code of human suffering. But as the 20th century drew to a close, the massive, terrifying empires built in his name began to rot from the inside out. The Berlin Wall would eventually be hacked to pieces by jubilant crowds. The Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own economic absurdity, and even China would quietly abandon strict Marxist economics to embrace a hybrid, hyper-capitalist state. It seemed, once again, that the story of Karl Marx was finally over. The Cold War ended. Capitalism had won the ultimate victory. The scholars and politicians of the 1990s confidently declared the end of history. The phantom had been exorcised, or so they thought, because you can tear down a wall and you can dissolve an empire. But burying an idea that feeds on human anger and economic desperation is a much, much harder task. The 21st century was waiting, and the ghost of Karl Marx was about to prove that it still had plenty of haunting left to do. When the Soviet Union officially collapsed on Christmas Day in 1991, the capitalist West threw the ultimate victory party. The Berlin Wall had been smashed into souvenir rubble. The statues of Lenin and Marx were tied to cranes and unceremoniously ripped from their pedestals across Eastern Europe. Western politicians and economists confidently declared the end of history. The great debate was finally over. Capitalism had won, liberal democracy had triumphed, and Karl Marx was permanently tossed into the historical garbage can, written off as a dangerous, obsolete relic of a dark and bloody century. For about 15 years, nobody in the mainstream took him seriously. If you mentioned Marx, people looked at you as if you were defending the use of dial-up internet or bloodletting. And then came September 2008. Suddenly, the global financial system had a massive, terrifying heart attack. The subprime mortgage bubble burst. Century-old, seemingly invincible investment banks like Lehman Brothers evaporated overnight. The stock market went into a catastrophic freefall, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth. Millions of ordinary, hard-working people lost their homes, their pensions, and their life savings. Meanwhile, the executives who had recklessly gambled the global economy into ruin were bailed out by the government and quietly walked away with millions of dollars in bonuses. In the immediate, panicked aftermath of the 2008 crash, a very bizarre phenomenon occurred. Across Europe and the United States, bookstores reported a sudden, massive spike in the sales of a 140-year-old book. Das Kapital was suddenly flying off the shelves. And it wasn't just radical college students buying it. It was bankers. It was financial journalists. It was Wall Street analysts. They were frantically dusting off Karl Marx because they realized an uncomfortable truth. Marx may have been a catastrophic failure at designing a functioning government, but he was a terrifyingly accurate diagnostician of capitalism's flaws. Marx had explicitly predicted the 2008 crash a century and a half before it happened. He had written that capitalism isn't a stable, self-correcting machine. It is inherently chaotic. He argued that it was hardwired to produce massive, devastating boom and bust cycles. He warned that the financial sector would eventually decouple from the real world, creating a fictional economy of credit and speculation that would inevitably implode. When the bankers read Marx in 2008, it was like looking at the blueprints of the bomb that had just blown up their house. But the real resurrection of the 21st century didn't come from Wall Street. It came from the people who were left to clean up the wreckage. Enter millennials and Generation Z. This is the first generation in modern history that is statistically predicted to be poorer than their parents. They grew up in the long, dark shadow of the 2008 crash. They played by the rules they were given. They studied hard, went to college, and got their degrees. But their reward wasn't a stable middle-class life with a house and a white picket fence. Their reward was absolutely crushing, inescapable student loan debt. They graduated into an economy that had completely mutated. The stable, lifelong jobs with pensions were gone. Instead, they were handed the gig economy. They became independent contractors, Uber drivers, and freelance delivery workers, hustling 3 different jobs just to pay rent for a tiny, overpriced apartment owned by a massive corporate hedge fund. They were told to embrace hustle culture, but it felt like a trap. To this new generation, the modern economic reality feels deeply, inherently rigged. They look at their phones and see billionaires launching themselves into space in private, phallic-shaped rockets, while they have to crowdfund their own medical bills. They see the wealthiest 1% hoarding more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire human race combined. And so, sitting in their cramped apartments, feeling exhausted, isolated, and angry, this young generation started searching for answers. They started scrolling through TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube. And waiting for them in the digital ether was the grumpy, heavily bearded ghost from the British Museum. Young people today aren't reading Marx because they want to rebuild the Soviet Union. They know about the gulags. They know about the famines. They have no illusion that 20th century communism was a success. They aren't looking for Marx the dictator. They are looking for Marx the critic. When a 25-year-old Amazon warehouse worker reads Marx today, the 19th century language suddenly makes terrifying sense. When Marx talks about alienation, the psychological destruction of feeling like a meaningless cog in a giant corporate machine, the modern worker feels seen. When Marx explains surplus value, the idea that your boss gets rich precisely by not paying you what your labor is actually worth, it validates their daily reality. Marx gives them the vocabulary to articulate their own misery. He tells them, "You aren't crazy. You aren't lazy. The system isn't broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It is a machine built to extract your energy." And now there is a new, even more terrifying shadow looming over the modern workforce, one that makes Marx's writings feel eerily prophetic. Artificial intelligence. We are standing on the edge of the greatest technological disruption since the steam engine. AI algorithms and robotics are no longer just automating assembly line jobs. They are threatening to replace writers, artists, coders, lawyers, and analysts. It is the ultimate capitalist dream. Maximum productivity with zero labor costs. A machine doesn't demand healthcare. A machine doesn't join a union. A machine doesn't sleep. Remarkably, Karl Marx saw this coming. In a series of obscure, unpublished notebooks written in 1858, known as the Grundrisse, Marx wrote a section called The Fragment on Machines. He envisioned a highly advanced future where automated machinery would do almost all of the physical and intellectual labor for humanity. In a rational world, Marx argued, this automation would be a utopia. It would free human beings from the drudgery of work. We would only have to work a few hours a week, leaving us free to paint, read, fish, and explore the universe. But, Marx warned, under a capitalist system, this technological miracle would become a nightmare. The wealthy elites who owned the machines wouldn't share the abundance. They would simply hoard the massive profits generated by the AI, while millions of human workers would be laid off, rendered completely economically obsolete, and left to starve in the streets. Look around today. As tech CEOs become trillionaires off the backs of generative AI, while tech workers face massive layoffs and creatives sue tech companies for scraping their life's work to feed the algorithm, Marx's 160-year-old warning doesn't sound like dusty philosophy. It sounds like tomorrow morning's news alert. The specter is no longer haunting the cobblestone streets of 19th-century Europe. It has upgraded. It is haunting the servers of Silicon Valley, the trading floors of Wall Street, and the smartphones of 1 billion exhausted workers. Karl Marx, the man who couldn't even manage his own household budget, has somehow clawed his way back from the grave to become the most relevant, dangerous, and controversial voice of the 21st century. If you take a walk through the quiet, shaded paths of Highgate Cemetery in London today, you will eventually come face to face with a massive, glaring bronze bust of Karl Marx. Carved into the heavy granite pedestal beneath his iconic beard are the words he wrote in a hurried panic back in 1848. Workers of all lands, unite. It is a permanent, intimidating monument to a man whose actual life was defined by absolute chaos, poverty, and contradiction. Karl Marx is the ultimate historical paradox. He was a champion of the working class who never actually worked a day in a factory. He was a globally recognized economic genius who couldn't balance his own household budget and watched his family suffer in the slums. He wrote with the explicit goal of liberating human beings from oppression, yet his complex ideology was weaponized to build some of the most oppressive, murderous, totalitarian regimes in human history. He was a brilliant diagnostician of capitalism's deepest flaws, but a catastrophic architect of what should replace it. Yet, whether you view him as a visionary prophet who perfectly predicted the anxieties of the modern world, or a demonic figure who provided the blueprint for 20th century tyranny, one undeniable fact remains. You are living in a world shaped by his pen. From the existence of the 8-hour workday and labor unions, to the scars of the Cold War and our modern fears about AI and corporate greed, the ghost of Karl Marx is permanently woven into the fabric of our lives. He remains, without a doubt, the most dangerous philosopher in history. But now, I want to turn it over to you. After hearing the raw, chaotic story of his life, what is your verdict? Was Karl Marx a misunderstood genius, or the ultimate architect of disaster? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this wild ride through history, Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.